When giants fall, the impact is felt across the entire world, leaving a legacy that never fades away. Witness the epic rise and the dramatic collapse of those who reached for the stars. Hit subscribe today and explore the ruins of greatness with us. My husband didn't even look at me when he said it. She has no idea what she's doing with money. Never has. He straightened his cufflinks, calm as a man reading a weather report. She's emotionally unstable, financially reckless, and frankly, Your Honor, I'm concerned she's going to destroy everything we built together before this divorce is finalized. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I looked down at the table and quietly moved my pen 2 inches to the left. 4 minutes. That was how long I had to wait before everything he just said became the rope he'd hang himself with. Have you ever sat in a room while someone who claimed to love you rewrote your entire life as a cautionary tale? Drop a yes in the comments if you know exactly what that silence feels like. I want to know how many of us have had to sit still while someone else told our story wrong, on purpose, in front of people with the power to decide our future. My husband, I'll call him my husband one last time, because after today, he'd just be a name on a document, had spent 14 years building a version of me that he needed the world to believe. Scattered, dependent, decorative. He needed that version to be real, because the alternative was too dangerous for him. The alternative was the truth. And the truth was sitting in a blue accordion folder on my side of the table. The conference room on the 32nd floor of Hartwell Family Law smelled like recycled air and expensive cologne. His cologne. He'd worn the same one since our third date, when he told me it was the scent that closed deals. I used to find that charming. Now I found it useful, because the moment I smelled it walking into a room, I knew to start recording. His lawyer, a man named Garrett, with the energy of someone who'd never once doubted himself, placed a thick stack of documents in front of the mediator. Our mediator was a retired family court judge named Sandra Okafor, and she had the kind of stillness that made both sides of a divorce table deeply nervous. What we have here, Garrett said, adjusting his glasses, is a pattern, Mrs. Calloway has, over the course of the last 3 years, made a series of financial decisions so erratic, so disconnected from any coherent strategy, that my client has had no choice but to request emergency protective orders on the joint assets. My husband nodded gravely. He'd practiced that nod. I'd watched him practice expressions in the mirror once, years ago. I thought he was being funny. He wasn't. Garrett continued. She transferred funds out of their joint investment account. She made unauthorized withdrawals. She opened accounts he had no knowledge of. And, most troubling, he paused for effect, she recently liquidated a significant position in their shared portfolio, costing them nearly $400,000 in unrealized gains. Without discussion, without warning, without, frankly, any apparent understanding of what she was doing. The room was quiet for a moment. My husband leaned toward his lawyer and whispered something. Garrett nodded. My husband looked at me with an expression I can only describe as pity, wrapped around triumph. He'd been wearing that expression for years, usually right after he explained to someone at a dinner party what I did, using air quotes I was apparently not supposed to notice. I used to translate. She does some freelance consulting, meant she doesn't really work. She manages the household portfolio, meant she plays with money I earn. She's very creative, meant she's not serious. He thought he was erasing me. He was actually composing my evidence file. Sandra Okafor looked at me over her reading glasses. Mrs. Calloway, these are serious allegations regarding your management of marital assets. Would you like to respond? I looked at my husband. He was ready for the defense. He was ready for excuses, fumbling, maybe some tears he could dismiss later. He'd coached me once, in a different context, about how I always got emotional in high-stakes situations. He'd said it gently, the way you'd describe a flaw in someone you pitied. He had no idea that the person sitting across from him today was not the woman he'd spent years carefully diminishing. I'd love to respond, I said. My voice was even, not cold, not sharp, even. But I'd like to ask Garrett a clarifying question first. Garrett looked slightly caught off guard. Go ahead. The $400,000 in unrealized gains. I folded my hands on the table. Which position specifically? Garrett flipped through his papers. He named a tech fund. A growth ETF my husband had been very proud of, had talked about at dinner with the kind of enthusiasm he normally reserved for golf handicaps. I nodded slowly. And when was that position opened? Garrett consulted the records. Approximately 2 years ago. And when was it liquidated? 11 months ago. And the funds went where? Garrett paused. He looked at the documents again. He looked at my husband. My husband gave a small, tight smile that was meant to project patience, but actually projected something closer to the early stages of panic. The funds were dispersed across several accounts, Garrett said carefully. Several accounts, I repeated. Could you be more specific? Sandra Okafor set her pen down. She was paying attention now. Garrett, shuffled papers. Some of that detail may require. I can be specific, I said. I opened my accordion folder. I did not rush. I'd learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing a woman can do in a room full of people who've underestimated her is move slowly. Slowly says, I have already won. I am simply letting you catch up. I slid a document across to Sandra. 1 page. Clean. Simple. The $400,000 did not disappear, I said. It was moved. By me. Into a separately titled investment account in my name, opened 16 months ago. I let that sit for a second. Because 16 months ago, I found out my husband had been having an affair for 3 years with a colleague named Denise and had been quietly routing marital funds through a consulting LLC she fronted for him. The room did not erupt. Sandra Okafor's rooms did not erupt. But something shifted in the air pressure. My husband's jaw tightened by a millimeter. I noticed because I'd spent 14 years learning to read a millimeter. That's a serious allegation, Garrett said. Yes, I agreed. So are his. I thought about the first time I suspected something was wrong. Not with the affair that came later. The first thing I noticed was a number. A small number, actually. A $340 discrepancy in a quarterly statement that any reasonable person would have written off as a rounding error or a fee. I am not a reasonable person when it comes to numbers. Numbers were the first language I ever loved. When I was 9 years old, I used to reorganize my mother's grocery receipts by category and find patterns in what we overspent. My mother thought it was annoying. My 6th grade math teacher thought it was a gift. 14 years into my marriage, it turned out to be a lifeline. My husband had built his version of me on the assumption that I managed our household portfolio as a hobby, a passion project, something to keep me occupied so he didn't feel guilty about the 80-hour weeks. What he never understood, what I had never corrected him on, was that I'd been quietly running that portfolio professionally, for other people, for 8 years. The freelance consulting he put in air quotes. I managed 7-figure accounts for 4 private clients under a separate business entity. I had an office. I had a business license. I had a CPA, a lawyer, and a compliance framework that would have made his firm's risk department weep with envy. He thought I was playing house with his money. I was building infrastructure with mine. And I had known about the LLC for 11 months before I sat down in this room. Here's what I did with those 11 months. First, I hired a forensic accountant. Not because I needed help understanding the numbers, I understood them fine, but because I needed documentation that could stand up in a court proceeding without anyone being able to argue I'd manufactured it. Every transaction the LLC had ever touched, every transfer, every date, amount, and destination. Second, I waited. This is the part people find hardest to understand. They ask, if you knew, why didn't you leave immediately? Why didn't you freeze the accounts, call a lawyer, file for divorce? Because I was 31 years old and I was not going to spend the next 2 years fighting over asset valuations and losing half of everything to a process that rewarded whoever made the most noise. I needed the picture to be complete. Third, I moved the $400,000, not to hide it, to protect it. There's a legal distinction, and mine was airtight because I had moved it into a properly disclosed account that I reported to my own attorney on the day I opened it. Everything was documented. Everything was dated. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. What I did not do was tell my husband. He thought the liquidation was impulsive. He told his lawyer I'd panicked. He told his sister I was acting out. He used the word erratic 4 times in the past month alone, in emails I had copies of, because I had set up a read receipt system on the family email account 2 years ago and he had never once noticed. Mrs. Calloway. Sandra Okafor was looking at the document I'd given her. This account was opened 16 months ago. Are you saying you've been aware of the alleged diversion of funds for that entire period? Yes. And you didn't alert your husband, freeze joint assets, or seek legal counsel at that time. I'd known this question was coming. I'd practiced my answer not to sound rehearsed. I sought legal counsel the same week. My attorney has the documentation. I nodded toward my lawyer, a quiet woman named Patricia, who had the energy of someone who had seen everything and judged nothing. I didn't freeze joint assets because I needed to understand the full scope of what had been moved before I acted. If I'd frozen everything at the first sign, he would have restructured, and I would have had a fraction of the picture I have now. Sandra looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at my husband. My husband looked at me. There it was. The moment a predator realizes the thing it cornered isn't cornered. We'd like to see those forensic records, Garrett said. His voice had shifted from polished to careful. Of course. I slid another set of documents across the table. My husband reached over and put his hand on Garrett's arm. A slight pressure. A message. Garrett stilled. There was a silence that lasted about 4 seconds. In high-stakes rooms, 4 seconds is an eternity. Then my husband leaned back and smiled. It was a different smile than the one from earlier. This one was slower, more deliberate. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a folded sheet of paper. "I was hoping we wouldn't need this," he said, with the tone of someone who had been absolutely counting on needing it. He passed the paper to Garrett, who unfolded it and handed it to Sandra. "This is a document signed by Mrs. Calloway 14 months ago," Garrett said. His voice had recovered its polish. "A financial agreement acknowledging her role as a non-managing spouse with respect to certain investment vehicles, including the growth fund in question. She agreed, in writing, that decisions regarding that fund would be made jointly with input from my client. Her unilateral liquidation was therefore not just impulsive, it was a breach of their private financial agreement." Sandra examined the document. My husband looked at me. It was the look he gave me when he was certain, not arrogant. Certain, he believed this was over. "The signature looks authentic," Sandra said, which was not a question. "It is authentic," my husband said. "She signed it at our kitchen table. She'll probably say she didn't read it." I felt something steady move through me. The way a river is steady, not because nothing is happening beneath the surface, but because it knows exactly where it's going. "It is my signature," I said. My husband exhaled slowly through his nose. The exhale of a man who had just won. "But I'd like to point out," I continued, "that the document was presented to me as part of a package of estate planning forms. 7 documents, all related to beneficiary designations for our life insurance policies. I signed all 7 in sequence in front of our estate attorney, Martin Cruz, on the afternoon of October 14th. I paused. Martin was retained by my husband. Martin did not provide independent counsel to me. Under our state's family law statutes, any financial agreement signed without independent legal representation can be contested as coerced or uninformed consent. I spoke to Patricia 3 weeks after that signing. I looked at Patricia. Patricia placed a letter on the table. Cool, quiet, dated 3 weeks after October 14th. Patricia advised me at that time that the document was likely unenforceable, I said, but I didn't need to fight it then, because the document only covered the growth fund. And the growth fund was not my main concern. I picked up my accordion folder again. My main concern, I said, was the consulting LLC. Meridian Advisory Group, registered in Delaware. Operational address listed as a UPS store in Scottsdale. I removed a stapled packet and placed it in front of Sandra. Over 22 months, my husband transferred a total of $612,000 from our joint accounts into Meridian, categorized across various line items, home office expenses, professional development, software subscriptions, none of which correspond to any legitimate business activity I have been able to document. Sandra's pen had stopped moving. She was reading. $612,000, I said. Routed through a company he incorporated using his girlfriend's mother's maiden name. The air in the room changed again. Not dramatically. Sandra's rooms never changed dramatically, but something shifted in the posture of every person at that table. Denise's involvement in Meridian is documented, I continued. Her signature appears on the initial registration. Her personal bank account received 4 separate transfers, totaling $91,000 over the past 18 months. I have the wire confirmations. My husband's face had gone the specific color of a man who spent years believing he was the smartest person in any room he entered. Garrett cleared his throat. These documents would need to be verified. They've been verified, Patricia said. It was the first time she'd spoken. She didn't say it loudly. She didn't need to. I had one more thing. I had debated whether to use it. It was the piece that went beyond the divorce proceedings. The piece I had spent 6 months deciding whether I was willing to deploy. I decided the morning I found out he'd told his mother I was having some kind of episode. That was the morning I decided I was willing. I removed the last document from my folder. In addition to the Meridian transfers, I said, I identified a pattern of fund movement that crosses state lines on 17 separate occasions between the Delaware LLC and a holding account in Nevada. The total moved in this pattern exceeded $500,000, which under federal statutes creates exposure for wire fraud. I set the document in front of Sandra. I provided a summary of these transactions to a contact at the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority 8 months ago. I was told at that time that a review had been opened. The silence that followed was different from the other silences. My husband looked at Garrett. Garrett was not looking back at him. Garrett was reading the document. You filed a regulatory complaint, my husband said. His voice was completely flat. All the performance had drained out of it. I provided information, I said. I was a witness to irregular financial activity. I had a responsibility to report it. 8 months ago, he said. Yes. He understood what that meant. 8 months ago, we were still married. 8 months ago, we were still sleeping in the same house, eating dinner together on Sundays, talking about what we wanted to do for our anniversary. 8 months ago, he had believed I was decorative. You reported me while we were still... I reported irregular financial activity that I had documented evidence of, I said. What you do with your own funds is your business. What you do with our shared funds is a matter I had both legal and ethical obligations around. He leaned forward. For the first time since we'd sat down, he looked unscripted. Why? He said. Just that. Why? I considered the question. It wasn't rhetorical. He actually didn't understand. That was, in some ways, the saddest part of all of it. He had spent so many years seeing me as something to manage that he had genuinely lost the capacity to imagine I had reasons. Because I spent 11 months watching you sit across from me at dinner, I said, telling me about your day, asking about mine, acting like a person who hadn't stolen from us. And I needed that to stop. Not just the stealing, the acting. Sandra Okafor set down the last document she'd been reading. She removed her reading glasses. She looked at my husband, then at Garrett, then at me. Mr. Calloway, she said, given the documentation presented today, I'm going to recommend we pause these proceedings pending review of the regulatory matter Mrs. Calloway has referenced. I'm also going to recommend that both parties seek independent legal counsel before our next session. She paused. And I'm going to suggest, strongly, that the framing of Mrs. Calloway as financially incompetent may benefit from significant revision. My husband said nothing. His cufflinks caught the light. Garrett began collecting his papers. He did not make eye contact with anyone. Outside, the elevator was empty. I stood in it alone for the 20 seconds it took to reach the lobby, and I let myself feel something I hadn't let myself feel in 11 months. The specific relief of having carried something heavy for a very long time and finally being allowed to set it down. Not joy, not yet, something quieter. The feeling of a room after a long storm, when the windows are finally dry and the air comes back in. The regulatory review concluded 4 months later. The findings were not good for my husband. Meridian was dissolved. Denise, whose mother's maiden name had been so useful, declined to provide testimony on his behalf. His firm placed him on administrative leave, pending their own internal investigation. I finalized the divorce on a Thursday. Patricia called me that evening. She said the settlement was, in her 20 years of practice, one of the cleaner outcomes she'd seen. I thanked her. She said I'd done most of the work myself. I told her that was the point. I sold the house we'd shared and bought a condo with a view of the water and a second bedroom I turned into an office. Real office. Desk, monitors, filing system, the works. No air quotes required. My 4th private client became my 5th, then my 6th. I kept the growth fund proceeds, properly accounted for. I put them into an index I'd been watching for 2 years, which, as of the date I'm telling you this story, has returned 22%. I deleted his contact from my phone on a Sunday afternoon. The same afternoon, I took a long walk along the waterfront and thought about what my 6th grade math teacher had said to me once. When I was annoyed that a classmate had copied my test answers and gotten a better grade, she'd said, "The numbers don't lie, sweetheart. They just wait." I thought about that for a long time. The numbers waited. And when the time came, they told exactly the story they were always going to tell. Peace isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like a blue accordion folder, a quiet lawyer, and 11 months of patience. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let someone believe they are winning, right up until the moment you show them the receipts.